Namaskar. Today we will be discussing another topic in our course on sales and distribution management. This particular topic is the selling process, and as far as this topic is concerned, we shall be covering it in two lectures, which will be lecture 20 and lecture 21. Now, lecture 20 happens to be the fifth lecture in the fourth module, and lecture 21 shall be the first chapter or the first lecture in the fifth module. So, let us first start with the selling process here, where we will talk about what the process is, and then the first four stages of the process we shall be covering in this particular lecture, and thereafter we shall be moving to lecture 21, where we shall be doing the other four stages, or the other three stages of the selling process. So, this particular lecture shall talk about the selling process, and the topics that are covered is the selling process and the various stages of the selling process. So, we begin here with a brief introduction about what this topic will deal about. Now, any and every salesperson sells different kinds of products in different kinds of situations, and he follows a sequential order. Now, this particular order would mean different stages in the selling process or in the sales cycle process. It is noteworthy that not all purchase situations, not all kinds of clients and customers, not all kinds of products and services would require this process to be followed in entirety. In fact, for certain kinds of purchase situations, for certain kinds of products, it may so happen that we do not follow an order at all in this way, but in certain kinds of situations we may have to go step by step following each of the different stages. I would also like to point out here that when we talk of goods, there are two kinds of goods: high involvement goods and low involvement goods. We have discussed about high and low involvement goods in the previous sessions as well, but just a brief recap on that. High involvement products are those where which are expensive, which are infrequently bought, where the level of perceived risk is high and the action is irrevocable, which means that once the product has been bought, it cannot be returned. It can only maybe repaired, or it can be the parts may be replaced, but it cannot return the product. So, the level of perceived risk is very, very high. On the other hand, there are goods which are low involvement goods, and in case of low involvement goods, what we talk of is the converse, where they are inexpensive, they are frequently bought, frequently used, and the level of perceived risk is low as compared to high involvement products. Also, the action is irrevocable in sense that if you don't like a product, you can always go and return it, or you can ask for a replacement. So, the process is not very, very complex in terms of low involvement products. Neither does the salesperson have to put in a lot of effort, nor does the customer or the prospect go through a very complex cognitive process before he decides to buy a product which is low on involvement. This is typically in the case of B2C. In the case of B2B, also we see high and low levels of involvement, and in there we would define that more in terms of the kind of complexity that goes about in the entire process, because it is not a straight simple decision taken by members of a family or by an individual in the case of B2C, as in the case of B2C, but it is more complex, where the buying decision is actually taken by a buying center, or the decision making unit, or the purchase unit of the organization. So, over there, even if products are low involvement products, they may involve some level of formality, some level of official procedures, some level of documentation, some amount of decision making. Now, in the case of B2B scenario, we speak of purchase situations as new task, modified rebuy, and straight rebuy. Again, we have discussed this very in the previous classes, but a quick recap. A new task is when a product or service is being bought by an organization for the first time, and so it is a very complex process. where the buying center needs to decide on the various criteria on which they must evaluate the product or the supplier, and they must also get to know the different alternatives available before which they can and it's only then they can start the buying purchase process. In the case of a modified rebuy, it is something where the product or the service offering has already been bought before, but there has to be some change with respect to newer attributes, newer features which are desired, or it could also be in the form of change in product specifications, delivery terms, pricing, etc. But in the case of a straight rebuy, it is actually a repeat order or repeat purchase. Now, in all of these cases, whether it a high or low involvement product spread across a new task or a modified rebuy or a straight rebuy, the salesperson would face different kinds of purchase situations, and he'll have to actually go through a different kind of selling process. Generally what he would go through is something which we will discuss today, but as I said, this may not, the different stages which we shall be discussing today may not always be required for all different kinds of products or for all different kinds of customers or for all different kinds of purchase situations. So, let us go into the selling process and the dynamics of the selling process. Now, salespersons will, as I said, follow a sequence of activities when they make a sale, and these may be defined as the different phases which a salesperson would follow. It would be a cycle which will start with identifying a prospect or a potential customer and converting him to a customer. Now what we are talking of here typically is a B2B scenario. It is, we are going to talk more in terms of the industrial buying process or the organizational buying situation. And if you recall, in the previous lecture we had spoken about something called the spin. We spoke about the spin as a communication focused strategy which a salesperson must adopt, where he must ask questions and then he must give a patient listening to the prospect, and through a series of questions which he would pose, he would be able to reach a close or reach a closure of the sale. Now, it's very important that the right kind of questions are asked, and that is how Rackham, who was actually who actually proposed the spin spin selling, he actually defined 4 different kinds of situations, four different kinds of questions which a salesperson must ask across different situations. Now, 1 was the situation questions, the 2 was the problem questions, the 3 was the implication questions, and the 4 was the need payoff questions. We discussed these in the previous lecture, and according to Rackham, if a sale has to be conducted successfully, it's very important that the salesperson asks the right kind of situation questions, problem questions, implication questions, and need payoff questions. The situation questions would make the customer or the prospective customer aware of a situation that he is facing. The problem questions would make him aware of a problem that he is facing which he probably has not realized till now. The implication questions will talk about how to make the prospect realize of the seriousness of the problem, and the need payoff questions would talk about the kind of benefit that the prospect would earn if he actually goes in for a solution to the problem through a purchase or through the benefit that a purchase would bring about. And so the different kinds of questions which we can have an example is like a situation question could be a salesperson asking a prospective customer, how do you describe your current situation, or what are the kind of things you are facing today. So a problem question would be further, why, when and how often does it happen. An implication question would be, is that problem really big? How has it affected you? How is it impacting you? And the need payoff question should be, if this problem is dealt with, what would the benefit be? So here the prospective customer or the prospect is made to understand on his own through a situation question as to what is this current situation. So it could be like, so how are things in your plant going on? So he would, the prospect would start talking about a situation which he is facing in his plant, and through a series of statements that he makes, the client or the customer would be able to understand the kind of problem he is facing, and this should lead to the next kind of situation, the next kind of question, which is the problem questions, where the salesperson must then ask, well, if your plant production is getting halted because of a breakdown of a machinery very often, how often does it happen, when does it happen, why is it happening? So the prospect then starts talking about the why, the when and how, and would be able to realize the seriousness of the problem. This would bring into the implication question to make the prospect again realize about the seriousness here. So the next question should be made or framed in such a way that the prospect realizes the implications. So the salesperson must intelligently ask, well, is this problem of breakdown too often? Is it really affecting you? Is it affecting your production line? Is it affecting your finished goods inventory? Is it going to lead to a problem? Would the competitor be able to gain advantage of this, halt in your production line and your, delivery schedules? Is it going to have an impact on the competitor? Will the competitor be able to sway away your customers towards him? So this kind of situation would make the prospect realize, these kind of questions would make the prospect realize that yes, I must act now, otherwise it's going to be a problem. And this brings the salesperson's role here now is to ask a need payoff question, which should be framed in a manner where the prospect begins to realize, yes, I have to look in for a benefit. So the salesperson must very intelligently put the next question where he should say that, yeah, if this problem is going to be sorted out, what would your benefit? Do you think there is something which is going to be beneficial? And then the prospect must understand and realize that yes, the salesperson's product or service offering or the kind of business that the salesperson is into is something which can help me, and the kind of product that the salesperson deals with is something which can bring me a benefit. So he would actually get into this action mode, or this mode into actually going in for a purchase of something which the salesperson has to offer. So the sales cycle would start when when the salesperson identifies a prospect, and then the salesperson job here is to begin the dialogue, and a spin could be an effective strategy. Now in the case of industrial buying, we see that the process is very complex, the sales cycle is very lengthy, and we have these different stages of the sales process. So we begin with prospecting and qualifying. Once the salesperson has his leads in place, he qualifies them to be prospects, and then he goes in for a pre-approach information search and pre-call planning. Thereafter the next stage is the approach, where he actually goes and meets the prospect. Fourth stage is the presentation and demonstration, where the salesperson makes a presentation to the prospect, gives a demo or demonstration, and then the next stage is where he overcomes objections which have been posed by the prospect, and then he goes in for a trial close and closes the sale, and then finally he must go in for a follow-up and service with the customer, so that customer satisfaction is ensured and loyalty can be built and long-term relationships can be achieved. So this particular process is something which has been proposed by Havaldar and Kawale, and this figure is sourced from his book on sales and distribution management, Text and Cases by Tata McGraw-Hill. Now, as I said in the previous few slides, I mentioned a little while ago as well, that the sequential order of the above steps would vary across selling situations. In fact, it may so happen that a salesperson may be very successfully able to lead a prospect across all these stages in the selling process. It may so happen that the process may get halted in between, or may get totally terminated in between. And so but it's important that the salesperson can carry out this process as efficiently and effectively as he can, so that there is a sale, and the customer could be satisfied at the end of the day, and it could be mutually beneficial for both the organized company as well as the customer. Now let us go into this process in detail, and we'll first start with the first stage, which is prospecting and qualifying. Now prospecting is the first step of the selling process, which involves identifying prospects. We start with identifying leads, and if in qualifying them if they are potentials. So the salesperson must identify as to who could be a potential customer. Now this would require an investigation into the need and or want or the requirements of the product, as well as the financial capacity to buy the product. So it's important that he investigates the prospect's need and or want and or requirement of the product, and of course the financial ability or the capability of the prospect to enter into a sale. Now a prospect here can be an individual or a group, in a family in the case of B2C. It could also be an organization which has a need and a want, and backed by sufficient purchasing power. Now it's important here that we understand that we can identify leads, but in order to qualify them as potentials, not only should they have a need and a want, but they also must have sufficient purchasing power. Now there is a difference between a prospect and a sales lead. A sales lead generates the name of a person in the case of B2C, or an organization in the case of B2B, that can be a potential customer or a prospect, that is one who has a need and want and ability to pay. What we are trying to say is that not all of the sales leads would have the need and want and or the ability to pay. So a sales lead would just generate the name of a person, okay, who can be a potential prospect, but whether he is a potential prospect or a customer or not, whether he is a prospect or a potential customer or not, would actually depend upon whether he has the need and the want and has the ability to pay. So the lead is generated, and then of the various leads who are generated, some of them qualify to be prospects or potential customers. So the salesperson has to identify who could be the potential customers, and his job here starts with first identifying the potential customers and then going forward. Now what are the different methods of prospecting? The salespersons could actually refer to people in their own circle, in their own network. They could seek referrals from existing customer bases. They could also seek help from sources like vendors and suppliers and channel intermediaries or industry and trade associations. Trade fairs and trade shows are again forums where salespersons can look for prospects or can identify prospects. The yellow pages and trade directories are again a source of prospecting. Now there is also something called cold canvassing, which again is a method of prospecting. Cold calling means or cold canvassing means just making unannounced calls to prospects who would get back once they have a need or a want. So very often salespeople go to organizations and leave behind their visiting cards or their business cards, sometimes even samples of what they produce and sell, and as and when required, the customer or the prospective customer would actually get in touch with them. Qualifying is very, very important. If the sales lead has a requirement of the product or the service offering and has the ability to buy the same, then the sales lead qualifies to be a prospect or a potential customer. It's very important here that the salesperson is able to assess the probable requirement of the prospects, and then he must classify them into hot, warm and cold. Now hot prospects are those who have a huge need for a company's product or service offering, and they are very, very financially sound. Such people must be actually dealt with by the company's own salespersons who would put in that effort to convert them from prospective to actuals. Warm prospects are those who have a medium or an average need of the company's product and service offering and are financially sound, and such prospects must be dealt with by the company's telemarketing team. Then we have the cold prospects or the cold prospects who have low requirements and their financial capacity also may not be too good. So they are people who can be dealt with by the channel partners or the trade intermediaries, or they could be dealt, they could be, their dealing with them could be postponed for later times. And the hot are those who have a huge need and are financially sound. Warm have medium or average need, and they are financially sound. They must be dealt with by the company's telemarketing team. And the cool or the cold are those who should be dealt with later. They could be, dealing with them could be postponed for some time in future. Salespersons must actually concentrate on the high potential customers, and rather than with those who are warm and cold. Okay, the next stage is what we refer to as the pre-approach or the pre-call planning. We refer to it as the pre-approach or the pre-call planning. Now, what is the pre-approach? In this stage, the salesperson gathers information about the prospect and tries to understand him, his background and his problems before making a sales call. So this enables the salesperson to be more organized, be more prepared with the first interaction with the prospect. It prepares the ground for the buyer-seller interaction or the dyad. And it's important here that the salesperson understands his the prospect's problems through other sources before he can actually present a solution through his dialogue and the presentation which would follow later. So it's the pre-approach important to design the product, so to design the problem solution linkage or the need benefit relationship, so that the salesperson is able to present the product as a benefit which would help solve a problem or satisfy a need which the prospective customer is facing. So salesperson may access different kinds of information sources, be it the company website, the internet pages, industrial and trade directories, business magazines, etc. Also, a pre-approach calling helps the salesperson gain familiarity with the prospect, and it helps build confidence. This would again increase the likelihood of a sale. The next is within the same stage is pre-call planning, where the salesperson must define the call objective, choose the selling strategy and decide on the method of presentation. So he must decide on the date and time as to when should the call be made and who must be approached in case of the buying center, that is in case it is a purchase committee which takes calls or which takes a final decision. The salesperson's job is here to decide who the person should be, with whom he must interact or whom he must approach and present his offering. So based on the information collected, the salesperson must customize the presentation to suit the prospect's needs and or problems. The next stage is the approach stage. Now this is the stage which starts when a salesperson sees the prospect. It ends when he begins a discussion with the prospect. So this is the initial few moments or initial few minutes which he spends with the prospect before he begins discussions on the product. So the first here, the salesperson must seek an appointment, and thereafter he would meet the prospect for the first time. Now approach involves an initial greeting, an introduction about self and about the company, and rapport building via verbal and non-verbal language. Now both creating a good impression and rapport building is very, very important. First impression of course gets created not only with your appearance but also with the kind of attitude that you exhibit or that you display. Now the stage is also important because the salesperson needs to attract attention of the prospect and hold the interest of the prospect. Different kinds of approach techniques may be used, which may be introductory, where you introduce yourself and the company, or it may be a praise where you start with praising the prospect's organization or his office or his appearance. It could also be a question where you start with asking, sir, is it the right time to talk? Or it could be a product and service benefit, you start talking, sir, I'm so and so, and I have come here to display this kind of a product or present myself to explain what this product is about or the benefits are about. Now the opening statements again would, if in the form of a question and a solution, would actually grab attention and solicit interest on the part of the prospect. And here is again where there are useful takeaways from the spin selling. So this particular stage would involve uncovering the needs and or problems that the prospect is experiencing, asking questions, listening to them. Problem identification questions and impact questions are very, very crucial here. And again, we can draw upon insights from the spin. Illustrating a solution as to how the salesperson can help via a benefit that the product or the service offering offers is again something which will attract attention and hold the interest of the prospect. Multiple question approach, which is the fundamental of the spin selling, can be very, very useful to attract attention and hold the interest of the prospect. Now, the salesperson must help the prospect recognize and realize that there is a need or a problem, and he must actually express a desire to help solve the problem. He must display a very, very humble service attitude, and the prospect's response is something which is very, very critical at this stage to take the process forward. The next stage is the presentation and the demonstration. Now, this is the stage where the salesperson describes his product and explains as to how it meets the buyer's needs. Now, we would not be able to emphasize much about the spin here, because in the case of spin, it is the buyer or the prospective buyer who must be encouraged to talk and speak. But in this case, it is more of the seller who must dominate the discussion, where he must make a presentation and give a demonstration. Now, it's very important to understand the fact that customers buy products and services to meet their needs and requirements, and it is important that the salespersons must understand the prospect's needs or requirements. He must begin the presentation keeping in mind the customer's needs and requirements, and how the product or service offering which he offers is something which would lead to a benefit which would help solve the need or the problem. So, he must be very humble, and he must illustrate to the prospect that his need or problem is something which can be definitely resolved. So, he must understand the prospect's mind and the cognitive processes through which the prospect passes, and he must move the prospect to a state of desire and conviction towards the purchase. So, it's very important here that the salesperson decides on the sales presentation method and develops a very, very good sales presentation and moves the prospect across stages of desire, action and purchase. Now, in the previous stage, in the pre-call and the pre-planning, the salesperson would already have done his homework with the kind of presentation he should make or the kind of strategy he must adopt. But the final call or the final decision must be made at this stage after the approach has happened. Now, what are the different kinds of sales presentation methods and strategies? There can be different kinds which we will deliberate on and explain more. There is a stimulus response method or the canned approach, the formula method or the formulated approach, the need satisfaction method, and the consultative selling method or the problem solving approach. Now, choice of particular strategy or a method again depends upon what is the sales objective. Is it cognitive, affective, behavioral? It should be based on the information about the prospect and his need, the product or service offering in question, whether the prospect is hot, warm or cold, and what are the different kind of resources which the salesperson has in hand, be it time or money. Now, let us talk about the different methods. The stimulus response method or the canned method involves a memorized sales talk which is delivered by the salesperson. It's a very standardized sales presentation where there is no linkage with the prospect's need or what the customer requirements are. It's a very structured approach, and the company's salesperson makes the same presentation and gives the same information to everyone. This kind of a method is used by telemarketers or by door-to-door salespersons, and it lacks customization in entirety. It is appropriate when the product is simple, when it is non-technical and the selling time is short. And again, it is something which will ensure that the salesperson makes the same presentation and gives the same information to everybody. Second is a formula method or a formulated approach where the salesperson uses the AIDA or the attention, interest, desire and action model and moves the prospect through the five mental states. It is based on the assumption that all prospects are similar and in similar situations, and the similar stimulus would lead to a similar response. It is a semi-structured approach. The same standard formula for different customers is used, While we focus on the attention, interest, desire and action, we also think about the fifth stage, which is satisfaction. And so the prospect moves through the 5 mental states, and it's responsibility of the salesperson to move him through these 5 stages. Now this particular approach is appropriate in cases of repeat purchases on the part of the customer. It is also appropriate when the salesperson is aware of the customer requirement, and so he would present his offering through the keeping in mind the attention, interest, desire, action and satisfaction model. The third is a need satisfaction method, which is where the salesperson identifies and understands the prospect's needs. He uncovers the needs, and it involves an interactive discussion with an emphasis on asking questions, listening to replies, thereby understanding what the prospect's problems are, what his needs and requirements are. So the method focuses on the individual customer and is used when the salesperson must understand the prospect's needs to be able to sell products which are expensive or technically complex. The salesperson uses the FAB approach, or the features, advantages and benefits approach. Now the FAB approach here means emphasizing upon the features, which are the physical characteristics of the product, the advantages or the performance of the product, and the benefits or the results of the performance. Now the results here could be functional, emotional, symbolic. Stressing the benefits is very, very crucial. People buy benefits, they do not buy products, and we have to understand here that benefits have to be very, very explicitly stated. So the features talks about the physical characteristics, the advantages talk about the performance, and the benefits talks about the results of the performance in terms of functional, emotional and symbolic benefits. Now the need satisfaction approach is an unstructured approach. It's highly customized to customer requirements or the customer needs, and it is appropriate in case of B2B. It is also in the case of B2C, it's appropriate for consumer durables, and it is also appropriate in cases where the salesperson is meeting the prospect for the first time. The next is the consultative selling method or the problem solving approach, where a cross-functional team is used and sales are conducted or sales presentations are made. Now the sales team is interdisciplinary from different departments, from different divisions, and the salespersons complement each other with respect to their knowledge, with respect to their skills and expertise. So it's a cross-functional expertise is the key. People from different functional areas work together to solve a problem that the prospect may be facing. So it's very, very customized and very flexible, and the method is appropriate in the case of B2B scenario, which involve technical products, costly products, capital intensive products, and where purchase decisions are made by people in the buying center. Also this would mean that the sales team would have to make multiple sales calls. So this method is appropriate for cases where product is highly technical, costly, capital intensive, and purchase decisions are made by the members of the buying center or the purchase committee, each of which can say no, each of which can say yes, and this would mean multiple sales calls at before the next stage is reached. So here we often can use the FAB selling technique with the sell sequence. So a FAB selling technique clubbed with the sell sequence, where you show the feature, which is F, you explain the advantage, which is A, and you lead into a benefit, which is B. Now showing the feature means S, explaining the advantage means E, leading into a benefit means L, and then of course it's important that you let the customer talk and listen to him, which is L. So that is how you club the FAB selling technique, and you use it with the sell sequence. Now before we finish, let us quickly talk about the essentials of an effective presentation. The salesperson must introduce the company, its market performance, its business lines, its product mix, the competitive advantages, important customers and clients. A mention about the competitive offering of course must only be made if it's absolutely essential, and in cases where the salesperson and his company offers a USP or a unique selling proposition. So a sales presentation must also be something which will build trust and goodwill. Demonstrations must be used because they help reduce doubts and fears in the prospect's mind. They provide explanation of the benefit, they reduce the complexity associated with the product. They also help a consumer experience a product, mentally. So the prospect can form mental images of the ownership of the product and the advantages and the benefit, and so this would move a prospect towards action. Demonstrations also gain customer attention, develop his interest, and the two-way communication between the prospect and the salesperson also is very, very beneficial. So in order to make a good presentation, plan the call, understand the prospect's need, select the right kind of sales presentation method, emphasize upon the benefits, provide facts, figures, talk about the features, advantages and benefits, make use of facts, figures, testimonials, also make use of technical aids, graphics, audio visuals. Visuals here, if in graphics, dramatization and demonstration again could be very, very helpful. And very important is that ensure that cultural norms are being adhered to, because in the case of selling, what is very, very important is building rapport, building interpersonal relationships, and so it's very essential that cultural norms are taken care of. So with this, we've come to an end of this particular lecture. The references are as follows, and I hope you found this lecture useful. We shall be talking about the next 3 stages in the next lecture. Thank you so much.